This session is organized in partnership with the Warsaw Security Forum and with the support of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Dear participants, welcome to the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. Our next panel is starting now.
Hello everyone, my name is Bartłomiej, and it is my pleasure to moderate our online and surely interesting panel discussion entitled Role of Values in Politics-Oriented Media Narratives, Lessons Learned for the Western Balkans. The panel is delivered in partnership with the Warsaw Security Forum and as a part of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs grant scheme. So for this fascinating reason, I'm hosting today a trio of distinguished guests, Marija Ristić, award-winning investigative journalist and regional director of Balkans Investigative Reporting Network. This was currently awarded by Reporters Without Borders for her leadership and work as an investigative journalist. Among others, Marija is currently fellow at Columbia University. Terry Martin, Berlin-based journalist, formerly with CNN International, now as the senior anchor to Welle News. He provided live coverage of G8 summits, UN climate conferences, natural disasters, and key elections, interviewing countless political and business, hosted TV discussion programs, and moderated major conferences for clients such as European Commission. Terry is a frequent host at the Global Media Forum and a great supporter of cross-border research initiatives. And Łukasz Pawłowski, a Polish political commentator who for 10 last years worked as a political editor at Kultura Liberalna, a leading Polish liberal magazine. His articles appeared in Polish and foreign media, including Gazeta Wyborcza and Financial Times. He currently works at the European Parliament and just recently started a great podcast on American affairs in Polish only, but I highly recommend it. Good afternoon. My pleasure to be with you all here today. And dear participants, as a rule for your activity, I encourage you to come up with questions as we are discussing, and I will proceed with taking them during the last 30 minutes of the panel. Please don't wait until the end and use the chat box for this purpose. Type in your questions as they come to your minds. Okay, let's go. In a space of just few recent months of the pandemics, the European Union was hit by almost 25% of all the disinformation campaigns of the last 5 years. We are facing the Belarus crisis, where the impact of social media on shaping the ability of protesters to communicate with the world is astonishing and crucial for the development of events. We are still in the Brexit mess, with all the discussions it opened on the impact of media narratives on referendum. The populists are shouting fake news or deep fakes when referring to media activity, without even understanding the difference between those two, blurring the public image of them and undermining our resilience to foreign influence of China and Russia. In all these events, we can clearly see the clash of values: freedom of speech versus propaganda, liberal democracy versus populism. That's the state of play I can think of. Now let's test your imagination. Should journalists refer to values while choosing the subject of their activity? Is there any space for including your personal values? What about the difference between state-owned media and private media? Are they able to operate within a pre-arranged set of values? Marija, we are starting with you. The floor is yours. Please continue.
Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot to colleagues at Belgrade Security Forum for organizing this, even in online setting. It is a very, I would say, important topic, but also a topic that is very difficult to discuss, especially if we have in mind different countries. So just at the beginning, I would like to say that I will be speaking in the regional context. And when I say regional context, I usually mean Western Balkans and one part of Central Europe. For this specific talk, I will also refer to Hungary on several occasions. And I think there are different ways you can tackle this. And I think it's very interesting that you mentioned journalists as key people in this operation of presenting values. But I think in our region, the key players are actually the editors and the managers. And when I was looking at the guidance for this talk, there was one interesting part about links with ownership and values of certain media. And I think for the Western Balkans, at least, this is the key thing. So who owns the media, and then who is the one who decides what the values are. And in the case of our region, ownership of the media is actually in the hands of the populists, so to say, or the governments, or it is not transparent enough, so we don't know who owns the media, but the content is presenting populist views. So basically, this is the root cause, I would see, of all of these other forms of portraying content, so to say, that also includes disinformation, foreign influence. But the key problem here is actually the owners, because in the Western Balkans, you don't have, like elsewhere in the world, owners who have clear idea that they want to give money to the certain media, not to earn money per se, but to actually have free media, democratic governments, etc. In our case, we have owners who are either tycoons or state-owned media or proxies of the government, and they use media only as a mouthpiece of their own values. Another important element that is linked to this is advertising space, and I'm speaking here about the mainstream media, who are actually mostly relying on advertising as a source of revenue. So advertising market is also not free, and it's not based on democratic principles. It's heavily controlled, either, as in the case of media, by the government. So the government is one of the big advertising companies, so to say, so it has a lot of money in advertising. The other element are people who work closely with the government, and they are big economic players in the countries, and then they influence the content through placing certain advertorials. So we had situation numerous in Serbia and in Hungary especially, where you had certain advertising agencies pulling out of the certain media outlets simply because they didn't like the content that the media outlets are putting there. So for me, as someone who is in the management of the media, I would say that for what kind of values we present in the media is actually the biggest responsibility goes to the owners and top editors. When it comes to journalists, I think this is more now, and it is becoming more a philosophical question and not so much the question of what we publish or not, but actually what we consider to be media ethics. Because we, as a journalist, when we were studying journalism and where we were starting to become journalists, this was one of the main things. It is what you considered to be an ethical thing to publish if you were journalist. And I remember back in school, there were several, I would say, key points when it comes to ethical journalism, and that's truth and accuracy, independence, fairness and impartiality, humanity, and accountability. So in that sense, if you look at just these values per se, then you would think that every journalist who respects all of this guidance, it will for sure present democratic values in its content. But going back into what I said at the beginning, when you have heavily controlled market and heavily controlled media, it's very difficult to be up to the standards and respect the ethics. And unfortunately, especially in the Western Balkans, ethics of journalism was never, so to say, on a high pedestal. So it was always something that we looked below, that it was below the radar. It was never pushed as something very important. And this is one of the reasons we also don't have good self-regulating bodies, for example, which are quite good in the Western democracies, and where you have, for example, journalists who are self-regulating the content and the media in the country. So in that sense, I think that we need to look, when we speak about the values and in general disinformation and propaganda, I think we need to look more into the root causes, which is the media market itself, and not the consequence, which is the content and what the media present. I think I was into my 5 minutes, but I'm happy to discuss this more later.
Thank you very much, Marija. So to put it straight, it's the ownership plus the ethics on the personal level of a journalist. So now let's ask Terry, who has the experience of working in the Western media, about his take on those issues. Please, Terry.
Thank you, Bart, and thanks also to the Belgrade Security Forum, also to the Warsaw Security Forum for helping to organize this. Great to see you again, Bart, and I'm very happy to be on the panel with these other distinguished panelists. It's what Marija just says. I can underline, of course, cover a lot of the principles that are extremely important to me. The whole question of media ownership is in the Western Balkans, from what I can gather, is a massive issue. So we are operating in a rather different environment. There is media pluralism in the environment that I'm operating in here. There's there is commercial media. There is government-funded media. We have media ethics boards that control what sort of public media is done in Germany. It's a very rich media landscape. The money that is collected from the obligatory television fees, broadcast fees for everybody in Germany, add up to billions of euros to fund public broadcasting. And you can be informed in Germany without having to worry too much about getting only slanted news. But the media environment that I'm working in is also coping with a flood of disinformation, and trying to counter that is a massive challenge. We're talking values in media in this session, and I have my own personal set of values. The values of the media organization that I work for, Deutsche Welle, are rather clear. The editorial oversight of Deutsche Welle is independent of the money that we are given is coming from the federal budget. So the Bundestag, the parliament in Germany, decides our budget, but then they hand it to us and say, we give you full editorial independence to operate within the framework of the basic law of the country. And the basic law of the country reflects many of the values that are anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And these values include a lot of things that we're familiar with from debates concerning freedom, freedom of expression, freedom for worship, freedom to be able to pursue what your interests are without infringing upon the rights of other people, basically. And these are part of my own personal code of ethics. So when I look for orientation in terms of values as a journalist and both as a representative of a media organization, I think about those values that are anchored in Germany's basic law, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Human Rights. Now, how you can get those, get a viewership for the kind of content that we produce with our values is another question. You know, we compete against commercial enterprises who have different interests and values and agendas. And part of it is agenda setting. We broadcast to the world. We're an international broadcasting organization. So, and not just broadcasting, we have a lot of online work. We work in 30 languages. So we're working to deal also for the Western Balkans to some degree, and Central and Eastern Europe, also important for us as well. But we recognize that we're operating in an environment where the average news consumer is getting their information not necessarily from us or other sources that adhere to those principles that you remember learning in journalism school, Marija, and so beautifully articulated. A lot of these people are consuming sensationalist information that is motivated by an effort to control the public opinion and get certain and rally support for particular points of view that do not conform to what I consider to be important, universal values. Anyway, just one. I'm not going to take more time. I hope we'll have a discussion about this. But the most important thing for me is to assure that what we're doing as media organizations is fact-based, as opposed to driven by interests that are going to take people down a path that could lead to further social polarization and deterioration of our democracies. There you go.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. So now let's ask Łukasz about this fact-based journalism and also how does the whole thing looks like in Poland. Łukasz, please.
Well, I'm not a journalist by education. I'm a psychologist and sociologist. I hold a PhD in political theory. But I would agree with most of what was already said, but I think you can take a step back even. So it's not only about the fact that your reporting is fact-based, which is obviously commendable and that's how it should be done. But the crucial decisions, I think, are taken even before that, because there are, in my mind, three major questions that the journalist or media organization must ask itself before they decide to report on something. And first is this really worthy of our attention? And these are simple questions, but the answers to them are pretty difficult. So the first one is this worthy of our attention? And I think the answer can have enormous consequences. To give you an example, the amount of time given to the so-called Hillary emails in the United States in 2016, the so-called scandal, had probably had some serious political consequences as for the result. It may tilted the result of the election towards Donald Trump, despite the fact that in the end no wrongdoing was proven. And so this year Trump tries to repeat, or his environment, his team tries to repeat the same trick by producing the so-called Hunter Biden's emails, those emails have very dubious, let's say, origin, and they are, it's not clear whether they should be trusted. So I think that this year media are much more reserved as far as covering this story is concerned. And this decision, whether do we cover this story or not, has enormous consequences. Then the question, what is the historical or sociological context of this event, I think. Because, and here another example from the United States, Black Lives Matter protests this year that swept through the States. So you could cover just the protests and say, and and be factually accurate and say what is happening in Kenosha or Portland and tell the story of what's going on there day by day or hour by hour, but it's not understandable without this historical and sociological context. So in this case, that would be the years, the decades of racism in the United States. That would be the events, similar events, similar to killing of George Floyd, similar events that happened in the United States in recent years, but also the current context, the context of the pandemic, the fact that it hits disproportionately hard communities of color and poorer communities. So that explains the frustrations, the anger of those people, but also the broader sociological context, for example, the incarceration rates in the United States or generally the prison system, how it affects different communities and what results it produces. But the most difficult question I think there is to ask before you run a story is, are there really two sides of the story? Or are there more sides to this story? Or maybe there is simply one side of the story and you cannot make the argument that, both sides have a point. In a famous, there is this famous TV series, Newsroom, on HBO. In one of the first episodes, they discuss precisely that question. And they take a jab at the New York Times by saying that if Republicans suddenly started to say that the world was flat, then New York Times would run an article with a headline saying Democrats and Republicans can't agree on the shape of Earth, which is obviously ridiculous because there are simply not two sides of this story. And this so-called biased fairness was also an allegation made against BBC during their coverage of Brexit campaign, where they gave an equal amount of time to both sides, even though one of the sides used this time to promote falsehoods or outright lies. The same goes for, let's say, climate change. The same goes for vaccines and the anti-vaccination movement. And the same goes, I think, because you asked me also about Poland, the same goes as far as the current protests in Poland against restricting access to abortion are concerned. Because on the one hand, you have those people who would like to ban it entirely, and on the other hand, you have those who would like to defend the previous law, which was conservative in comparison with other states, or would like to liberalize it. And here you have a question: do you really have two sides of this story, and are those arguments on both sides equally should have equal time to be presented on the media? And one more thing, pluralism of the media is obviously a value. But just a short comment how pluralism of the media is understood by the current Polish government, which funds the public media and which are used as a tool as a propaganda tool. And their explanation is that now we have pluralism, media pluralism in Poland, because you have private media which are more anti-government, and you have public media which are unequivocally, which are simply pro-government, and that's how they define the pluralism, which is obviously a ridiculous definition, I would say. So, but basically my point is that it's not even, it's important to follow certain values when you report on the subject, but the very important questions are asked even before you start reporting on a given subject. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Łukasz. So let's follow up with this with this line of thought. And Terry, let's get back to you. Because I wanted to ask you about the impact of media on the image that on the image of the ongoing events, that they can influence actually the policymakers. So while presenting the news, they can influence the actions of policymakers. So that's also the case of the choice of the topic prior to start reporting. So what's your take on that, Terry?
Absolutely. Definitely media and politics are in a reciprocal relationship there. It's one depends on the other. I happen to be married to a politician, so it's been very valuable to watch how that plays out from her perspective. But I worked as a political journalist for a long time, as a political correspondent covering lots of different elections and parties, and it was a great value to me to be able to go to all the different party conferences, which are generally quite boring, right? The long speeches, and they go on for days, and you just sit there and you're listening and hope something will come through. But it is very easy to watch how a headline will change the discourse in a political environment. So absolutely, the media influence the politics as much as politics influences media. Unfortunately, if you end up in a situation where politics own the media and they use it for their own propaganda purposes, then you've got a serious problem. And media pluralism is a big issue that is addressed by organizations like Reporters Without Borders. They rank a number of countries. They do their country rankings, and you can look at that. By the way, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Council of Europe both have been looking very closely at the media landscape in Western Balkans. Just pleasure of reading some of their material last night to get a better understanding of what's going on in the environment that we're talking about today. But anyway, yes, sure. What I find really interesting in terms of the way media influences politics and the way that politics respond is that you do have media organs, media outlets, also in Germany, who will decide that in order to get a great headline, they will simply ignore certain elements of a story that will support a headline, that will sell newspapers, for example. And I've observed that in different contexts, and that's really disturbing, and that violates basic media ethics. Łukasz was talking about, which I think was really important, the whole idea of news selection. Absolutely. What a news, when you are a newspaper editor, you have to decide what goes on the front page, what goes in the back page, how much space you're going to give to a particular story. We decide that every day. I do 4 news shows a day when I'm anchoring, and we have to decide how we're going to structure those shows, what's going to be in and what's not going to be in, what are we going to cover and why. And some of that is just basically what happens in the world. You've got a natural disaster, a major election that is going to change the political course in a place, a war, a bomb explodes, Beirut, for example, not a bomb, but an explosion where people die. We clear that we're going to talk about that, or the U.S. election, whatever. But at some point, it becomes agenda setting. You do set an agenda. There's a saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and this is about Marija doing investigative journalism, where you try to cast a light on something that is happening, and what you choose to cast a light on is going to change the political discourse. You would hope, if you can get an audience for what you're doing. But yeah, sure, there's a massive influence on politics from media, for sure. But I know a lot of politicians. They wake up in the morning. They may not like the Bild-Zeitung, which is Germany's main tabloid paper. This is not a paper they might read on vacation when they're not in office, but they know it's the largest circulation daily in Europe, and it is going to influence how politics gets discussed. So sure, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for this take. So we know what's the problem currently. All of you have described it from their own side, but in majority of the topics you actually agree on the problem. So my question goes to Marija right now, because we know that we have to protect ourselves, like protect also the liberal democracy from this cronies of governments, the willingness to influence the media as well. But is this really the media's role to take a stance in this ongoing discussion on the liberal democracy versus populism? And if so, how to do that? Marija, please continue. I guess you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I did, I think. Yeah. For me, I think the key word is context. We as a journalist give to the certain stories that we cover and what we write as a context. And I think modern journalism or contemporary journalism today is a lot of quotes journalism. So a lot of journalists just pick up quotes, either from social media or in general from different clips from different people who speak about certain issues, whether it's politicians or experts, etc. But we don't give context to anything we are writing. And this is very important when we want to write about populism or democracy or issues around populism and democracy or illiberal democracy, however you want to call it. So I don't think journalists necessarily need to take a stance, but they need to write facts and they need to write the truth. And they need to try to be objective, which is not always easy, and many journalists cannot do it properly. And this is, I think, the hardest part. But anyway, I think giving the context to the things that are happening around us is very important. And we mentioned here Black Lives Matter movement, and we mentioned here Hillary emails. And I think these two examples are quite good when we are also speaking about context and how American media actually play around it, and did they give a context to that or not. And I think speaking about whom we give voice, it's also, I think, a new discussion in journalism when it comes to giving platform for opinions. And this is now, I think, a big venue for discussion about ethics and editorial choices. And there was a very good example recently with the New York Times, who actually sacked their opinion editor when they provided space for a person who was actually denying the whole concept around Black Lives Matter movement. So in that sense, it's also the responsibility what you as a media editor publish. So whether the opinions that you give space to are correct or not. And I think this is at the end the old school journalism, whether this is true or not. And this is the main thing. There is no, I think, new solution to it, although there are new ways how we do journalism. But at the end, I think the essence of it, it's really the same as it was 50 years ago.
Okay, thank you. You've mentioned those modalities, something that comes as a new thing and probably can influence the old style journalism. So automatically I think about the disinformation and fake news as a tool used by foreign propaganda. Probably it was somewhere hidden during the last years before we even recognized it. It is like a circulating topic right now in all the media outlets and also in politics. And what I would like to ask you, because I'm starting right now to take questions from the audience, and there is also a question from the audience, disinformation in the Western setting. It is the ability of media to react to this influence of disinformation and fake news as a tool of foreign propaganda. So one of our friends who are listening to us actually asks if you do recognize certain Chinese propaganda in the Western Balkans right now, similar to those things that are already done by Russians in media outlets such as Sputnik, for example. So, Marija, if you could combine in the answer to my question those two elements, your own take on the ability of media to react to this information, and if you could give us the example of, let's say, some kind of a Chinese propaganda that was already undercovered in the Western Balkans.
Issue of propaganda in the Western Balkans is not so new. In a way, different sorts of propaganda were existing even from the 90s, so since the collapse of communism. But I think there are new producers of propaganda, definitely, but they're not so much foreign triggered from abroad, so to say. So when it comes to Russian propaganda, I think Western Balkans is quite different example than elsewhere, because there is, I would say, natural affiliation towards Russia that exists, or friendship. Sometimes I even joke a love story between Russia and Orthodox community in the Western Balkans. So, for example, when we looked like from the investigative part into who are the producers of Russian propaganda, it was never like a website in Moscow or a money from Moscow. It's actually politicians and far-right parties and people who in general believe in Russian values, so to say, and the Russian view of the world. So in that sense, it's very domestic problem. It's not imported like elsewhere in Europe. Chinese propaganda is something quite new, and it's much more invisible than the Russian propaganda, simply because the Chinese propaganda goes through the investment. So the Chinese are big in the economy in the Western Balkans, and all they're doing that in secret. They sign different kind of contracts with the governments that are not public. So in that sense, we don't know as journalists how much money they pour in, what are the projects that they're doing. So basically, there is no transparency, while governments promote Chinese investments, or in general state of China, as a friend of the Western Balkans. So I'm not speaking, of course, about everyone here. I'm speaking mostly about Serbia and parts of Bosnia, where we have a lot of Chinese investments, and China is seen as an ally. So they, for example, are key messengers simply because governments allow them. So governments appear next to the Chinese authorities, ambassadors, different business people from China, and because governments control most of the media, then the messages that we are receiving from China are quite strong. So you don't have like a typical Chinese propaganda like you would have in the US, or attempts in Germany or in any other countries. Mostly money, and then with money it comes other things.
Thank you very much. Terry, you've been active well, you are all the time in questioning the policymakers that come to your studio, so you have a lot of those different TV interviews. But I've seen you being quite active in reporting on Belarus crisis as well, and we are also having a lot of disinformation about that topic. So if you can give us the some take from your side on this ability to tackle fake news and disinformation from you as a senior news anchor in Deutsche Welle.
Well, I'll do my best. Thanks for the question. Yeah, what's happening in Belarus, of course, is extremely interesting and potentially very dangerous. The people who are going out on the streets and protesting are risking their lives. I can only hope, first of all, that no harm comes to them. In terms of disinformation, there's at the very beginning there was quite a bit of disinformation surrounding the forces that were driving this, let's call it a revolution in Belarus. Lukashenko, he was suggesting that NATO forces are massing and that it was being the protesters were being controlled by foreign forces as opposed to it being a homegrown grievance that had boiled over 26 years that he's been in power. How to counter that is a tough one. I talked to correspondents there. I talked to different people who are involved in the protest movement. I had the pleasure of talking to Ms. Tikhanovskaya on a couple of occasions, and for them, it's absolutely essential that information is getting into Belarus to help the people there be informed of what's going on in that country and outside the country, and it's really important to them that people outside the country understand what's going on there. So the only way that you can counter disinformation in that context is to continue to try to tell the story as well as you can factually about what's happening on the ground. Our correspondent was kicked out of the country. His press credentials were not renewed, but there still are people who are operating in the country and still are doing some good work. All I can say is keep devoting the resources to being out on the street and reporting what is happening and what's going on. When the protesters say they want a dialogue with Lukashenko, that needs to be communicated, I think, in a way too, because they are looking for
Okay, I believe that. Can you hear me? So that's a problem of the connection on Terry's side. So let's skip this part, and Łukasz, I'm gonna ask you a question. Oh yeah, here he is. Terry, the floor is yours. Please continue.
Sorry, just final. Maybe you can be more specific about what I can tell you regarding this. As there's only so much I can say. Providing context.
Okay.
Łukasz talked about context, and so did Marija. How important that is, and we're talking about background.
Okay.
I think it's really important to make sure that background is also communicated too. How did we get here? When there are allegations put out there that the election was rigged, how do we reach that conclusion? And I think it's really important to look at that carefully and discuss how we got to that point, because I tend to believe in people making rational choices, and maybe they can come to their own conclusion about that.
Okay, thank you. Well, somewhere in my mind there was also this case of big tech companies that are actually quite counterproductive right now towards the Belarusian opposition, banning the bloggers such as Niechta, for example, for spreading the news via social media. But yeah, well, we have concluded, I guess, on this disinformation topic. There's also a question from the audience that regards actually the COVID pandemics and whether media were okay in covering the story, or they're spreading the fear, they're spreading the fear and scaremongering the people rather than covering the story properly. But I believe Łukasz, when answering the question, I will try to ask him in a second, can refer to that, because I'm trying to get back to the Polish perspective right now, and this is the place where I would like to engage you, Łukasz. because we're now in Poland in this clash, let's say, of values that is actually taking place even on streets right now, and a part of it is also the maybe some kind of the plans of the government to renationalize the media as a way forward of next tranche of reforms. So, Łukasz, if you could refer to this relation, how to the Polish context and our ability to protect the media, the freedom of media from this poll system of the government, from the willingness to actually to influence the story.
Well, the rules are, if you want to introduce some rules, the rules are only going to be as good as the people who are supposed to abide by them. And if there is a powerful player that does not want to abide by the rules, they are simply that there is no way you can enforce them. And I think the Polish case is a good example of that. Because the public media, which were financed from the budget, from the public money, you could argue they were biased in favor of government, no matter who was in the government. You could measure it in different ways. For example, the amount of time given to certain politicians or certain political parties in a given framework of time. And you could argue that there was some bias in favor of government, no matter who the government was. But then all those, informal rules that were in place before were simply shattered, and the current government and the current the media, the public media, are not even shy about it. As I said, they explain it that way. The private media are biased against us, so the public media are going to be biased in favor of what we are doing. And that's how you establish pluralism of the media scene. So there is no way you can actually enforce that. The questions and enforce any change until there is a change in government. The question that you need to answer as a journalist, as a political commentator, is: do you engage with the public media at all? Do you go there? Do you accept their invitations to present your point of view, even though you can expect that there will be 4 other people with an exactly opposite point of view, and you risk being overwhelmed? Or do you reject it and you risk not being able to present the opposite side of the opinion spectrum, but at least you do not somehow legitimize what they are doing? You do not give them their argument that, look, we invite different sides of the story. So this is one question that you need to ask. The second question is, how do you even engage with that with that media scene which is so biased? That is, should you maintain your standards like claims to objectivity, or given the fact that the media platform, the playing field is not level at all, should you engage more and be more favorable, even be more biased towards the other side? And I think it's a very difficult question. And only recently, during the current protest that we have now in Poland against the more restrictions on abortion, only yesterday there was this case that is, I think, a good example. A private radio station has this morning show to which they invite different guests, and it's from 7 to 9, so it's a morning prime time for them. And they invited only men and only conservative men to have these conversations about the protests. And obviously people were enraged, their listeners, because their listeners, the audience, is more favorable towards those who protest the new laws. And the station backed down. first they invited some women and those who were on the different side of the event, and then later in the evening they apologized for what happened in the morning. So this is very difficult situation, I think, for Polish journalists and for Polish commenters, because the way you present the news, the way the people you invite to give their opinion, it already frames the debate. And if you have a media scene which is so biased towards one side in the public media, should the private media take some more responsibility, or should they engage more in favor of the other side? I think it's extremely difficult. There are still many journalists who simply want to report the media, report the news, report what's happening in the government's camp, what's happening in the opposition, what's happening in the streets. But I think there is this moment when you have to simply say that, no, there are no two sides, no two equal sides of this story, and I'm reporting it as I think it should be reported, and I'm not reporting it as if there was a legitimate argument between two equal sides of the story. That's what I would say. It's not easy. I know it might be a slippery slope, but on the other hand, journalists also have consciousness. They are also human beings, and they also have some opinions. And it's sometimes I think those opinions should be expressed even when you try to be objective and you try to report what's going on. That's my point.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Łukasz. As we are running out of time, I have 2 minutes for each one of you to let's say sum up, to give us a conclusion from your points for from this discussion for the public from the Western Balkans. So let's start from Marija.
So for me, the key thing is actually ethics. So do we as a journalist and editors do ethical journalism or not? And I think there should no be negotiations, or compromises. And I think this is something that we have to do by ourselves, because a lot of things today are called journalism, but they're actually not. And I think it is up to media and journalists to fight this. We cannot expect that someone else will resolve this crisis of journalism, because I think people on the ground are actually seeing it, and they appreciate the quality journalism. We have a lot of disinformation, and that's true, and COVID showed that, but I think also COVID showed how important is actually good journalism, quality journalism. And in this period, we really had some great examples of data journalism, of investigative journalism, exposing corruption around COVID. So in that sense, I really look this as our own fight of people who are media owners, editors and managers, but also journalists. It's not easy, and we said that several times. But I also think that crisis really showed why good journalism matter. And I would really like to end it in more optimistic note, this discussion.
It's not always the optimism that actually let us influence the thoughts of people, and let's not fear not being optimistic in this discussion, to be honest. Terry, your turn.
Fact-based journalism is absolutely essential for a society to develop an understanding of who they are in relation to the rest of the world. And if fact-based journalism is marginalized
Okay, but Terry will probably unfreeze in a second. So, Łukasz, let's start with you. Hi, Łukasz, can you hear me? Oh, yeah, there he is.
Here to
Sorry,
times,
Terry, I couldn't hear you at some point. Yeah.
I'm sure. I'm really sorry. Well, I'll just keep it quick and snappy.
Well, the technical difficulties of today's world. So we're living in the future. COVID is all around us, but we still have the problems with connections, unfortunately, even from such a big state as Germany. So, Łukasz, please, if you could continue with your final remarks.
Well, it's quick. What I said, that sometimes you have to take a stand and express your opinions, even if when you try to be objective, because simply there are no equal sides of the story. The other thing is, I absolutely agree that despite your private opinions, you should do the reporting and report the facts as well as you can. And even when you are attacked by the so-called by your political allies, the people who share your who hold political opinions which are dear to you, and I think there is an enormous value in that. So for again, the United States, I think, provide a very good example. It's not enough to criticize Trump. It's not enough to scold him. It's not enough to say how outrageous persona he is, but to really help American democracy or liberal democracy in general. It's equally important to understand what Trump is the symptom of, what are the underlying reasons, what is the rationale for people who, despite the last 4 years, still support him. And I think that can only be beneficial to all sides of the argument and the society itself. So I'm not as optimistic maybe as Marija, because when you look at the trust that people hold in journalism, in journalists, it's not terribly high, unfortunately. But I think it's the only way to go, that you can have your opinion and can and should express it sometimes, but also you should be simply curious in what are the opinions and rationale of the other sides of a given argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Łukasz. And let's try to test the German internet once again. Terry, final 1 minute for you. Let's hope that this time it will work.
There's probably some nefarious force out there who's interrupting me when I'm trying to say something. Media literacy is extremely important. We can produce great quality journalism, but if the people can't recognize it as being quality journalism, we have a big problem. So I think there's a lot to do in everywhere to help people sort out the quality journalism, distinguish.
Okay, I believe that the words from Terry are floating somewhere in the air. They will come back to us at the very end. But I have to stop here and now, because we really ran out of time. And well, that was a pleasure to see you all today virtually, even Terry, who's somewhere frozen here in between. I believe our listeners now have a great overview of the impact of values and what's the impact of the values on presenting media narratives. And what is especially crucial for me is that this discussion is that we remember that the freedom of thought embodied in ability to speak freely via media is one of the key values in the liberal democracy. And protecting it serves us all, and serving it protects us all. So in Poland, in the Western Balkans, and everywhere in the world. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Łukasz. Thank you, Marija. Hope to see you somewhere in person, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for watching the online panel of the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. We will be back soon.